The Galactic Academy's most prestigious xenobiology classroom had seen its share of disasters. Food fights between methane-breathing Volthans and oxygen-dependent Crenids. Mating displays from overeager Zentorians that had left scorch marks on the ceiling. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. That memorable incident when a gelatinous blob from Sector 9 had accidentally absorbed half the periodic table display. But today? Today was shaping up to be something entirely different. Vera sat in the back row, her human-manufactured notebook open to a fresh page, stylus poised with the kind of eager attention that made most of her classmates either snicker or shake their various appendages in bewilderment. The exchange program had been controversial enough without Earth's representative being so enthusiastic about learning. Most species considered enthusiasm a sign of either stupidity or insanity. Humans, it seemed, suffered from both in abundance. "Settle down, you worthless collections of genetic accidents," Dr. Kell announced to the class, his reptilian voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. His scales shimmered an irritated shade of green-yellow as he surveyed the motley collection of species scattered across the amphitheater-style seating. "Today, we examine predatory instincts across species. Try not to demonstrate them on each other. Again." The doctor's eyes, all three of them, lingered on Vera for a moment longer than necessary. The human exchange student had been a source of constant bewilderment since her arrival. Where other species either cowered in appropriate fear or puffed themselves up in territorial displays, she simply existed, took notes, asked questions, treated apex predators and prey species with the same bland politeness she might reserve for a cafeteria server. It was deeply unsettling. "Professor," came a rumbling voice from the middle section, "will we be covering pack dynamics among the Nethrix today?" Dr. Kell's scales rippled with poorly concealed nervousness. The question had come from Vox, one of 3 young Nethrix currently enrolled in the class. The Nethrix were what happened when evolution decided that regular predators weren't terrifying enough and needed an upgrade. Standing roughly 8 feet tall when fully mature, they possessed retractable claws that could slice through titanium, sensory organs capable of detecting fear from across a room, and a pack mentality that had conquered 12 star systems before the Galactic Council had convinced them that education might be more profitable than warfare. The cubs were smaller, only 6 feet tall, but no less intimidating. Their obsidian black fur absorbed light like a living shadow, and their eyes glowed with an amber luminescence that suggested they were always calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to reduce their classmates to component molecules. "Ah, yes," Dr. Kell managed, his voice climbing half a high octave. "The Nethrix. Fascinating species. Apex predators of the highest order, responsible for more interstellar incidents than any other currently enrolled species." Hult, the second Nethrix cub, let out what might have been a chuckle, or possibly the sound she made while contemplating which of her classmates would make the best afternoon snack. Her claws extended slightly, clicking against her desk surface with the casual menace of someone sharpening knives. The third cub, Neff, was examining his own talons with the kind of scientific interest that most species reserved for particularly complicated mathematics. He was the largest of the 3, with shoulders that suggested he could bench press a small spacecraft without breaking a sweat. Around the classroom, other students had developed the kind of hypervigilant awareness that prey species cultivated when sharing space with things that ate them for fun. Kell, a nervous herbivorous creature from the outer rim, had pressed himself so far back in his seat that he was practically melting into the upholstery. His leaf-green skin had taken on the pallor of something that had just realized it was on the wrong end of the food chain. Jara, whose crystalline structure refracted light in patterns that normally indicated calm contemplation, was emanating the kind of brittle energy that suggested she was ready to shatter herself into 1,000 pieces at the first sign of trouble. Her species had survived eons by perfecting the art of strategic fragmentation. Better to exist as scattered shards than become someone's lunch. Now then, Dr. Kell continued, his teaching momentum somewhat dampened by the predatory atmosphere, predatory instincts serve multiple functions across species: hunting, territorial defense, resource acquisition, mate selection. He paused to project a holographic display of various species' hunting patterns. The images flickered through scenes of Zentaurian fire hunts, vegan crystal trap formations, and several other techniques that made the herbivorous students look progressively more uncomfortable. The key factor in understanding predatory behavior, the doctor droned on, is recognizing the triggers that activate hunting responses. Rapid movement, displays of weakness, pheromone signatures indicating fear. As if summoned by his words, the 3 Nethrix cubs began to move. It started subtly. Vox stretched, his powerful frame uncoiling with the liquid grace of something that had never encountered a situation it couldn't handle through violence. Holt's amber eyes began tracking the smaller students with the kind of focus that suggested she was conducting a very specific kind of mathematics. The kind that involved trajectory calculations and blood spatter patterns. Neff simply stood up. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence. Several students began edging toward exits. Kell made a sound that was either a whimper or possibly his species version of a final prayer. But Vera just kept taking notes. Her stylus moved across the page with steady, unhurried strokes, capturing Dr. Kell's lecture with the kind of methodical attention that suggested she found predatory behavioral patterns genuinely fascinating rather than personally threatening. She occasionally glanced up at the holographic displays, nodded thoughtfully, and returned to her notebook. She didn't seem to notice that 3 apex predators had begun prowling through the classroom like sharks who'd caught the scent of blood in the water. Or maybe, and this was the possibility that made Dr. Kell's remaining scales turn an alarmed shade of orange, she simply didn't care. The Nethrix cubs moved with purpose, weaving between desks and terrified classmates with the kind of casual menace that suggested they were either about to demonstrate exactly why their species dominated most of known space, or they were heading somewhere specific. That somewhere, Dr. Kell realized with growing horror, appeared to be the back row, where the human sat, still taking notes, completely oblivious to the fact that 3 of the galaxy's most efficient killing machines were converging on her position like a perfect storm of teeth and claws. "Miss Vera!" Dr. Kell called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Perhaps you'd like to move to a different seat? For optimal learning purposes?" Vera glanced up, her expression mildly puzzled. "I can see the display fine from here, Dr. Kell." "Thanks, though." She returned to her notes. Behind her, Vox had reached her row and was now standing directly beside her desk, his massive frame casting a shadow that should have triggered every survival instinct possessed by a species that had evolved from prey animals. Vera reached into her bag, pulled out a different colored stylus, and continued writing. Dr. Kell watched in fascination and growing panic as the classroom dynamics shifted into something that defied every principle of interspecies behavioral science he'd ever studied. The predators were in position. The prey was completely unaware. Every other student in the room was radiating the kind of terror that should have triggered an immediate feeding response. And yet, something was wrong. Or maybe, he thought as he watched Vox's amber eyes studying the human with an expression that wasn't quite hunger, something was very, very right. In a way that nobody, least of all Dr. Kell, was prepared to understand. What happened next would be discussed in xenobiology circles for decades to come. Not because it was violent, though everyone expected it to be. Not because it was scientifically groundbreaking, though it certainly was. But because it was so utterly, completely, impossibly mundane that it broke several fundamental assumptions about how the universe was supposed to work. Vox, all 6 feet and 3 inches of apex predator, leaned down toward Vera's desk. The classroom held its collective breath. Kell had actually stopped breathing entirely, his photosynthetic processes shutting down in anticipatory shock. Jara's crystalline structure was vibrating at a frequency that suggested she was moments away from explosive fragmentation. Even Dr. Kell had reached for his emergency beacon, though what exactly the Academy's security team was supposed to do against 3 Nethrix cubs was anybody's guess. Vera glanced up from her notes. "Oh, hi there. Did you have a question about the lecture?" The words hung in the air like a challenge to the very fabric of reality. Vox blinked his glowing amber eyes. Once. Twice. His head tilted slightly to the right, in a gesture that, on a creature capable of dismantling a battlecruiser with his bare claws, looked almost curious. "You're not afraid," he said, his voice carrying the kind of rumbling undertone that most species associated with imminent death. "Should I be?" Vera asked, genuinely puzzled. "We're in a classroom. You're a student. I'm a student. Dr. Kell is explaining predatory behavioral patterns, which is actually pretty interesting stuff." She tapped her stylus against her notebook. "I was just writing down his point about how territorial displays vary across species based on environmental pressures. Did you know that pack hunters from high-gravity worlds tend to develop more sophisticated communication systems than solitary predators?" Fascinating stuff. Vox stared at her. Hult, who had been approaching from the left, with the fluid grace of something that had perfected the art of silent killing, stopped mid-stride. Her claws, which had been extended in what every other species recognized as a threat display, slowly retracted. Neff, bringing up the rear with the inexorable advance of a natural disaster, actually sat down. Not in his assigned seat, 3 rows forward. Right there in the aisle, his massive frame folding with surprising grace until he was settled on the floor like the galaxy's most dangerous house cat. "This is," Dr. Kell started to say, then realized he had no idea how to finish that sentence. This was unprecedented. This was impossible. This was giving him a migraine that would require a visit to the Academy's medical wing? All of the above. Really? "Continuing with our lesson," he managed, his voice climbing toward the upper registers of his species' vocal range, "we observe that predatory species typically maintain strict hierarchical structures within their social groups." His words trailed off as Vox did something that defied every piece of scientific literature ever written about Nethrix behavioral patterns. He yawned, not the kind of yawn that preceded violence, a common intimidation tactic among his species. Not the kind of yawn that indicated boredom with inferior prey. This was the kind of yawn that suggested he was genuinely tired. "Long day?" Vera asked conversationally, not looking up from her notes. Vox made a sound that might have been agreement. Then, with the kind of casual disregard for protocol that would have given the Academy's administrators collective heart attacks, He settled down beside Vera's desk. The movement was fluid, natural, like water finding its level. One moment he was standing, radiating the barely contained violence that had made his species the terror of 3 galactic sectors. The next, he was curled up next to a human's school supplies, his breathing beginning to deepen into something that sounded suspiciously like, "Is he purring?" Jara whispered, her crystalline structure flickering with colors that indicated complete cognitive overload. Because he was. The low, rumbling sound emanating from Vox's chest was unmistakably the kind of contentment purr that Nethrix cubs made when they felt completely, utterly safe. Which should have been impossible. Nethrix didn't feel safe. They made other things feel unsafe. That was their entire evolutionary niche. Hult, meanwhile, had completed her approach and was now studying Vera with the kind of intense focus that usually preceded dismemberment. Her amber eyes tracked every movement of the human's stylus, every slight shift in posture, every breath. "Interesting technique you're using for note-taking," she said, her voice carrying the kind of conversational tone that was utterly at odds with her species' reputation for communicating primarily through violence. "Thanks," Vera replied, still writing. "I learned it in primary school. The trick is to summarize the main points while you're listening, then fill in details during pauses. Helps with retention." "Primary school," Hult repeated, as though the concept of formal education for beings who weren't already apex predators was a novel concept, which, for her species, it probably was. She settled down on Vera's other side. Just sat down. Right there on the floor, her powerful frame arranging itself with the same casual grace that Vox had demonstrated. Within moments, she too was producing the low, rumbling purr that indicated a Nethrix in a state of complete relaxation. The classroom had gone silent, except for Dr. Kell's increasingly frantic attempts to continue his lecture, and the growing symphony of contented purring from 2 of the galaxy's most feared predators. "The hierarchical nature of pack hunting," Dr. Kell continued, his voice taking on the slightly hysterical edge of someone trying to pretend that reality hadn't just taken a hard left turn into the impossible, requires clear communication between pack members to coordinate attacks on prey that might otherwise escape. He gestured toward his holographic display, which was currently showing a group of Nethrix adults taking down something that looked like a cross between a rhinoceros and a small building. The irony of the timing was not lost on anyone present. "Dr. Kell," Vera called out, raising her free hand while continuing to write with the other. "When you say hierarchical, are you referring to age-based dominant structures or capability-based leadership roles? Because I've read some interesting papers suggesting that pack coordination might be more fluid than traditional hierarchy models suggest." What?" Dr. Kell blinked all 3 eyes in rapid succession. "You've read papers? On Nethrix pack dynamics?" "Just a few," Vera said modestly. "The Academy's library has an excellent xenobiology section. Dr. Venth's work on interspecies behavioral evolution was particularly interesting, though I thought his conclusions about aggression triggers were a bit oversimplified." Vox raised his head from where it had been resting against Vera's notebook bag. "Dr. Venth studied our species?" "Among others," Vera nodded. His comparative analysis of hunting patterns across apex predator species was really well researched, though he seemed to focus primarily on territorial behavior, rather than social bonding patterns. "Social bonding?" Hult repeated, as though testing the words for flavor. "Sure," Vera said, finally looking up from her notes to make eye contact with the massive predator beside her. "I mean, pack hunting requires trust, communication, mutual support. Those are all forms of social bonding. Pretty advanced stuff, really. Neff, who had been quietly observing from his position on the floor, made a sound that might have been laughter. She thinks we're advanced. You are, Vera said simply. Multi-system coordination, resource management, complex social structures. Your species has accomplished things that most others only dream about. That takes intelligence, not just instinct. The purring got louder. Dr. Kell stared at his class, watching two apex predators settle more comfortably around a human who was discussing their species' accomplishments with the same tone someone might use to compliment a friend's cooking. The third predator was now lying fully stretched out on the floor, his eyes half closed, in what could only be described as blissful contentment. "This is not," he said carefully, "how predatory species typically interact with prey animals." "Well," Vera said, glancing around at her new companions, "I suppose it's a good thing we're all students here instead of predators and prey, isn't it?" She returned to her notes, the stylus moving steadily across the page, while three creatures that could have conquered small planets dozed peacefully around her desk like the galaxy's most dangerous security detail. Dr. Kell looked at his holographic display, which was still showing footage of Nethrix pack hunts, then at his classroom, where three Nethrix cubs were apparently using a human exchange student as the galaxy's most unlikely security blanket. He paused the lesson. Not because he'd planned to, not because it was time for a break, but because reality had apparently decided to take an unscheduled vacation, and he needed a moment to figure out where exactly it had gone. The break that Dr. Kell called lasted exactly 11 minutes before the Academy's emergency response protocols kicked in. Not because anyone had triggered an alarm, though Kell had briefly considered it when Neff's purring reached a volume that rattled the windows, but because three separate monitoring systems had detected behavioral anomalies significant enough to warrant immediate investigation. Apex predators displaying pack bonding behavior toward prey species registered as a Class 3 evolutionary impossibility. The Academy took its impossibilities very seriously. "What exactly?" Dr. Kell demanded of Vera, his scales now cycling through colors that indicated severe psychological distress. "Did you do to them?" Vera looked up from her notes, where she'd been sketching the sleeping arrangements of her new companions with the kind of scientific interest that suggested she found the whole situation academically fascinating rather than personally alarming. Vox had somehow managed to curl up in a way that used her notebook bag as a pillow, while still leaving her access to her writing materials. Hult had arranged herself as a living barrier between Vera and the rest of the class, her position suggesting she was prepared to defend the human from any perceived threats. Neff remained stretched out across the aisle, effectively creating a perimeter that no other student dared cross. "I haven't done anything," Vera said, sounding genuinely puzzled. "We're just sharing space." "Sharing space," Dr. Kell repeated, his voice climbing toward frequencies that only small nocturnal creatures usually employed. "You're sharing space with three members of a species that has conquered more star systems than any other currently enrolled life form." "Well, yes," Vera agreed, "but they're students here, just like me." "Why would I treat them differently?" The question hung in the air with the weight of a small philosophical revolution. Before Dr. Kell could formulate a response that wouldn't require immediate medication, the classroom doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss that announced the arrival of reinforcements. Dr. Fenwick entered with the kind of multi-limbed efficiency that suggested urgent scientific curiosity rather than emergency response. Dr. Fenwick possessed the kind of insectoid physiology that most humanoid species found unsettling. 17 eyes arranged in strategic clusters, mandibles that clicked when thinking, and a general air of being able to process information at speeds that made quantum computers look sluggish. The perfect candidate for investigating the impossible. "Fascinating," Dr. Fenwick announced, all 17 eyes tracking different elements of the scene simultaneously. "Absolutely fascinating." The pronouncement was accompanied by a rapid series of clicks that indicated intense intellectual excitement. Dr. Fenwick approached the sleeping predators with the fearless curiosity of someone whose species had evolved, past the point where physical destruction held any particular terror. "Dr. Fenwick," Dr. Kell began, his relief evident. "Thank the void you're here. Something is terribly wrong with these cubs." "Wrong?" Dr. Fenwick's primary eye cluster swiveled toward Dr. Kell, while the secondary clusters continued their examination of the unprecedented scene. "I see nothing wrong here. Unusual, certainly. Unprecedented, absolutely. But wrong? No." Dr. Fenwick extended a scanning device that hummed with the kind of energy signatures that suggested it could analyze molecular structures from across the room. The device swept over Vera and her sleeping companions, collecting data with the methodical efficiency of serious science in action. "No pheromone manipulation," Dr. Fenwick announced, reading the results with the kind of rapid-fire clicking that indicated intense processing. "No psychic influence, no technological interference, no chemical agents, no electromagnetic field generation." The doctor paused, mandibles clicking more slowly as additional data streamed across the device's display. "No indication of any external influence whatsoever," Dr. Fenwick continued. "This appears to be entirely natural behavior." "Natural?" Dr. Kell's scales shifted to a color that indicated he was reconsidering his career choices. "There is nothing natural about apex predators using prey species as sleeping aids." "Ah," Dr. Fenwick said, all 17 eyes suddenly focusing on Dr. Kell with laser precision. "But that's where your analysis becomes flawed. You're operating under the assumption that we're observing a predator-prey dynamic." "They're Nethrix," Dr. Kell gestured frantically at the purring cubs. "She's human. The classification is obvious." "Classifications," Dr. Fenwick observed, with the kind of mild reproach that suggested Dr. Kell might want to revisit some basic scientific principles, "are descriptive tools, not predictive absolutes. What we're witnessing suggests that our current classification system may be incomplete." At this point, Vox stirred from his comfortable position against Vera's bag. Not the kind of stirring that suggested he was preparing to defend territory or assess threats, but the lazy movement of someone who'd been woken up from a particularly good nap and wasn't entirely pleased about it. "Are we done with break time?" he asked, blinking amber eyes that held more sleepy confusion than predatory menace. "Not quite," Vera said gently, reaching over to pat his shoulder with the kind of casual affection someone might show to a favorite pet. "The doctors are just running some tests." The gesture should have triggered immediate violence. Touching a Nethrix without permission was considered an act of war by most galactic civilizations. Physical contact with apex predators ranked somewhere between inadvisable and suicidal on the standard safety charts. Vox leaned into the touch like a cat, seeking affection. "Tests?" Holt opened one eye, her voice carrying a note of curiosity, rather than the territorial aggression that usually characterized her species' response to unknown activities. "Scientific investigation," Dr. Fenwick explained, apparently unconcerned by the fact that 3 apex predators were now paying attention. "We're attempting to understand the behavioral dynamics at play here." "Oh," Neff said, raising his massive head from the floor. "Are we being interesting?" The question was delivered with the kind of genuine curiosity that suggested he'd be pleased to be found scientifically significant rather than offended by the scrutiny. "Exceptionally interesting," Dr. Fenwick confirmed. "Your behavior patterns are unlike anything in the documented literature." "Good interesting or bad interesting?" Vox asked, settling back against Vera's bag. "Definitely good interesting," Vera assured him, returning to her sketching. "Groundbreaking research. Kind of interesting." "Cool," all three cubs said in unison, apparently satisfied with this assessment. Dr. Kell stared at the exchange with the kind of expression that suggested he was questioning not just his understanding of xenobiology, but possibly the fundamental nature of reality itself. "This is not," he said carefully, "how interspecies dynamics are supposed to work." "According to what?" Dr. Fenwick asked, genuine scientific interest evident in the positioning of multiple eye clusters. "Existing models are based on observed behaviors under specific conditions. When conditions change, behaviors change. That's basic adaptive biology." "But they're predators," Dr. Kell insisted, his voice taking on a slightly desperate edge. "She's prey." The relationship is defined by evolutionary imperatives that have remained constant across millions of standard years. Has it, though? Dr. Fenwick moved closer to the group, scanning device still humming with activity. "When was the last time any of you observed a Nethrix interaction with a human under non-threatening academic conditions?" The question prompted a moment of silence as everyone, including the Nethrix cubs, considered the implications. "Never," Kell volunteered from his position pressed against the far wall. "Humans only joined the exchange program this cycle. Most species avoid Nethrix space unless they're conducting official diplomatic missions with heavy escort." "And diplomatic missions," Jara added, her crystalline structure flickering with sudden realization, "involve formal protocols designed to minimize interaction and prevent conflicts." "Exactly," Dr. Fenwick said, clicking with satisfaction. "You've all been operating under assumptions based on limited data. What happens when an apex predator species encounters a potential prey species that displays no fear response, no territorial challenges, and no submission behaviors?" "They should still attack," Dr. Kell said weakly. "Predatory instincts don't require specific triggers. The opportunity for an easy kill should be sufficient." "Should be," Dr. Fenwick agreed. "But what if the prey species has evolved social strategies that transcend traditional predator-prey dynamics?" "What do you mean?" Holt asked, genuinely curious. Dr. Fenwick's mandibles clicked rapidly as data continued to stream across the scanning device. "Humans are unusual among spacefaring species. They evolved from a prey animal background, similar to many others, but their social development took an unprecedented path." The doctor gestured toward Vera, who was still taking notes while three apex predators used her as a combination pillow and security detail. "Most species develop either dominance hierarchies or submission patterns when dealing with superior predators. Fight or flight, essentially. Humans developed a third option." "Which is?" Vox asked, settling more comfortably against Vera's shoulder. "Integration," Dr. Fenwick announced. "Rather than competing with apex predators or fleeing from them, humans developed the social intelligence to coexist with them. They became pack-adjacent rather than pack-challenged." "Pack-adjacent?" Neff repeated the term, as though testing its flavor. "Think about it," Dr. Fenwick continued, warming to the theoretical implications. "Your species respects strength. But what you're responding to in Vera isn't weakness disguised as strength. It's genuine non-aggression coupled with complete lack of fear. She's not submitting to your dominance, and she's not challenging it. She's simply existing alongside it. That's— Dr. Kell paused, his scales shifting toward colors that indicated reluctant intellectual acceptance. That's actually a remarkable evolutionary adaptation. It explains the behavioral response, Dr. Fenwick agreed. Apex predators have evolved to recognize threats and opportunities. But Vera represents neither. She's genuinely non-threatening while simultaneously displaying pack-positive behaviors, sharing space, showing interest in your achievements, treating you as equals rather than superiors or threats. So, we're not reacting to her as prey, Holt said slowly, her analytical mind working through the implications. We're reacting to her as— what? Pack-adjacent, Vox said, trying out the term. Like a pack friend? More than that, Dr. Fenwick said, mandibles clicking with excitement. Based on these readings, I believe you're reacting to her as a pack guardian. The silence that followed was profound. A what now? Neff asked. Pack guardians, Dr. Fenwick explained, are theoretical constructs in advanced social evolution. Individuals who provide security and comfort to pack members without competing for resources or status. They're not part of the hierarchy because they don't need to be. They serve a function that transcends traditional pack dynamics. Vox struggled with the concept. Like a den, Holt said suddenly. Not a pack member. A place of safety. Precisely. Dr. Fenwick's excitement was evident in the rapid clicking pattern. Vera has essentially become a mobile safe space for your pack instincts. You're not protecting her from threats. You're protecting your access to the security she represents. The three Nethrix cubs looked at each other, then at Vera, then back at Dr. Fenwick. That, Vox said slowly, is really, really cool. It's unprecedented in interspecies behavioral science, Dr. Fenwick agreed. And it means, Neff added with growing enthusiasm, that we're making history just by taking a nap. Revolutionary napping, Holt proclaimed. I like it. Dr. Kell looked around the classroom at his students, some hiding against walls, others clustered around a human exchange student who was casually revolutionizing everything they thought they knew about predator-prey dynamics, and realized that his carefully planned lesson on traditional behavioral patterns had just become completely obsolete. Class dismissed, he announced weakly. Nobody moved. The Nethrix cubs had fallen asleep again. Vera was still taking notes, and everyone else was too fascinated by the ongoing impossibility to actually leave. Dr. Kell sank into his chair and began planning his resignation letter. But before he could compose the first line of professional defeat, his communicator chirped with an incoming priority message. Then another. Then a cascade of alerts that suggested the academic universe had suddenly developed an urgent interest in his xenobiology classroom. Dr. Kell, came the voice of Administrator Wellix, the Academy's head of interspecies relations. We're receiving reports of unusual behavioral phenomena in your classroom. Please confirm status. Dr. Kell glanced at Vera, who was now sketching what appeared to be a detailed diagram of Nethrix sleeping positions, while the subjects of her study provided live reference material. Vox had somehow managed to position himself so that his purring created a gentle vibration that seemed to help Vera's stylus flow more smoothly across the page. Status is educational, Dr. Kell replied carefully. Educational, Administrator Wellix repeated in the tone of someone trying to process information that didn't fit into any existing category. And the reports of Nethrix cubs displaying non-aggressive behaviors toward a human student? Accurate, Dr. Kell confirmed, watching Hult gently nudge Vera's bag closer when it started to slip off the desk. Extremely accurate. A pause that suggested Administrator Wellix was reconsidering several life choices. "We're sending a full research team," the administrator announced. "This could have significant implications for interspecies diplomatic protocols." The communication ended just as Dr. Fenwick's scanning device emitted a new series of excited beeps. All 17 eyes focused on the display with the kind of intensity that suggested a major breakthrough in progress. "Fascinating," Dr. Fenwick muttered, mandibles clicking in rapid staccato patterns. "The behavioral modification isn't limited to the immediate interaction group." "What do you mean?" Dr. Kell asked, though part of him really didn't want to know. "Observe the other students," Dr. Fenwick instructed, gesturing toward the rest of the classroom. Dr. Kell looked around and realized that something fundamental had shifted in the social dynamics of his class. Kell, who normally spent most of his time pressed against walls in terror, had actually moved closer to the central group. Not close enough to risk actual contact with apex predators, but closer than he'd ever voluntarily positioned himself before. Jara's crystalline structure was emitting the kind of stable, clear light that indicated genuine calm rather than the brittle tension she usually maintained in mixed-species environments. Other students throughout the classroom had adopted more relaxed postures, their various stress indicators, scale colors, pheromone signatures, defensive positioning, all suggesting a general reduction in ambient fear levels. "The Pack Guardian effect appears to be environmental," Dr. Fenwick observed with growing excitement. "Vera's presence isn't just calming the Nethrix cubs, she's creating a zone of reduced territorial tension that's affecting the entire classroom dynamic." "That's impossible," Dr. Kell protested weakly, though his heart wasn't really in the denial anymore. "Is it, though?" Dr. Fenwick asked. "Think about pack dynamics from an evolutionary perspective. If you have a guardian who represents safety rather than competition, it makes sense that their presence would signal safe zone to other pack-adjacent species as well." To demonstrate the point, Dr. Fenwick gestured toward a small cluster of students who had been maintaining careful species-segregated seating arrangements since the beginning of the semester. A vegan crystal former was actually sharing desk space with a methane-breathing Volthan, their normal mutual avoidance apparently suspended in the ambient atmosphere of reduced threat levels. "The implications are staggering," Dr. Fenwick continued. "If humans can serve as neutral moderators in interspecies conflicts simply by existing in shared spaces, the entire foundation of galactic diplomacy would need to be reconsidered," Dr. Kell finished, finally beginning to understand the scope of what they were witnessing. "Exactly," Dr. Fenwick agreed. "We're not just observing a behavioral anomaly. We're watching the potential evolution of interspecies relations in real time." At that moment, Vera looked up from her sketching and noticed the increased attention from her classmates. Rather than seeming uncomfortable with the scrutiny, she offered the kind of friendly smile that most species associated with non-threatening social interaction. "Would anyone else like to see the notes?" she asked, holding up her sketches. "I think I've captured some interesting data about relaxed predator positioning patterns." The response was immediate. Students who had spent the entire semester avoiding each other began moving toward Vera's desk, drawn not by the human herself, but by the unprecedented opportunity to examine apex predators at close range without fear of immediate dismemberment. "This is remarkable," whispered Kell, actually approaching within 10 feet of the Nethrix cubs to get a better look at Vera's sketches. "I've never seen detailed documentation of Nethrix resting behaviors." "The purring frequencies are fascinating too," added Jara, her crystalline structure flickering with academic interest. I didn't know your species produced harmonic resonances during relaxation states." "Neither did we," Vox admitted, stretching contentedly. "This is the first time we've been relaxed enough in a mixed-species environment to actually purr properly." "You've never been fully relaxed around other species before?" Vera asked, looking genuinely concerned. "Never," Holt confirmed. "Other species either challenge us or flee from us. There's never been a middle option." "That must be exhausting," Vera observed, with the kind of genuine empathy that most species reserved for members of their own kind. Always having to be on in social situations. The three Nethrix cubs exchanged glances that suggested this was a perspective they'd never considered before. "It really is," Neff said slowly. "We've been maintaining territorial displays since we were old enough to leave the den. This is the first time in cycles that we've been able to just exist." "Well," Vera said, returning to her sketches, "feel free to exist as much as you need to. This is a classroom, not a battlefield." Dr. Kell watched this exchange and realized that his resignation letter would have to wait. What was happening in his classroom wasn't a crisis requiring damage control. It was a breakthrough that would require extensive documentation and probably a complete rewrite of several textbooks. The future of interspecies relations, apparently, was going to involve a lot more napping than anyone had previously anticipated. The research team that Administrator Wellix dispatched arrived with the kind of scientific enthusiasm typically reserved for discovering new forms of mathematics or accidentally creating pocket universes. What they found was Vera finishing her afternoon snack, while a steadily growing collection of apex predators from various species had arranged themselves around her desk like the galaxy's most dangerous study group. Somewhere between Dr. Fenwick's initial analysis and the arrival of the research team, word had spread through the Academy's predator-heavy enrollment. A pair of Zentaurian firehawks had perched themselves on nearby desks, their usual territorial aggression replaced by curious observation. A juvenile kraken from the deep space sectors had actually squeezed itself through the classroom door, no small feat given its size, and was now contentedly coiled in the corner, occasionally offering helpful corrections to Vera's xenobiology notes. "This defies every principle of evolutionary behavioral science," announced Dr. Harwick, the team's lead behavioral specialist, while frantically documenting the scene. "Does it, though?" Vera asked, glancing up from where she was helping Vox with his own homework. Advanced mathematics, as it turned out, rather than creative dismemberment or whatever other species assumed apex predators studied. Or does it just suggest that behavioral science has been working with incomplete data? The question landed in the room with the impact of a small philosophical bomb. Dr. Harwick blinked, all four of his eyes, in sequence, and realized that a first-cycle exchange student had just casually challenged the theoretical foundation of his entire career. "Elaborate," he said, with the tone of someone who suspected they were about to have their worldview comprehensively demolished. "Well," Vera said, setting down her stylus, and unconsciously reaching over to scratch behind Holt's ears, in a gesture that should have resulted in immediate amputation. "Most behavioral studies observe species in controlled environments or natural habitats, right? But how often do they study what happens when you remove competition for resources and status from the equation entirely?" Holt leaned into the ear-scratching with a purr that resonated through the floor. "Academic environments aren't resource competitive," Vera continued. "We're all here to learn, not to establish dominance or secure territory. So what you're seeing isn't aberrant behavior. It's what happens when apex predators don't have to be apex predators." The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either violent disagreement or revolutionary scientific breakthroughs. She's suggesting, Dr. Fenwick said slowly, mandibles clicking with the rhythm of rapid processing, that predatory aggression is situational rather than innate. Not just situational, Vera corrected gently. Optional. These guys are incredibly intelligent, socially sophisticated beings who happen to also be capable of impressive violence when circumstances require it. But when circumstances don't require it. She gestured around the room, where various apex predators were engaged in activities ranging from collaborative note-taking to what appeared to be interspecies philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness across different neural architectures. When circumstances don't require it, Neff observed from his position stretched across 3 desks, we can be ourselves instead of our reputations. The comment hung in the air with the weight of genuine insight. Your reputations, Dr. Harwick repeated slowly. You mean the behavioral expectations other species place on you? Exactly, Vox said, looking up from his mathematics homework. Everyone expects us to be aggressive, territorial, threatening. So we are, because that's what keeps other species at a safe distance and prevents conflicts that we'd rather avoid anyway. But you don't want to be aggressive? Dr. Kell asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire understanding of the universe was undergoing rapid reconstruction. Do you want to be nervous and fearful all the time? Holt countered reasonably. Because that's what most species do around us. We adapt our behavior to manage their expectations and keep everyone safe. Safe, Dr. Harwick echoed. You maintain aggressive displays to keep other species safe? Aggressive displays prevent close contact, the juvenile kraken contributed from the corner, its voice carrying the deep resonance of something that could sing in frequencies that shattered asteroids. Close contact leads to misunderstandings. Misunderstandings lead to injuries. So you've all been performing your most intimidating behaviors as a form of social courtesy? Dr. Fenwick asked, all 17 eyes wide with amazement. Pretty much, confirmed one of the Zentorian firehawks. Easier than dealing with the aftermath of accidentally incinerating someone who got too close. Vera nodded thoughtfully. It makes perfect sense from a social evolution perspective. You've developed threat displays that function as protective barriers rather than actual aggression. The problem is that other species interpret the displays as genuine hostility rather than polite boundaries. But you don't, Vox observed. Well, no, Vera agreed. Where I come from, if someone doesn't want to interact, they just say so. We don't assume that impressive capabilities automatically translate to hostile intentions. Where you come from, Dr. Harwick said carefully. What do you call species who possess overwhelming capabilities but choose not to use them aggressively? Vera considered the question. Civilized? The word hit the assembled researchers with the force of a paradigm shift traveling at light speed. Civilized, Dr. Kell repeated, his scales cycling through colors that indicated profound conceptual recalibration. Not apex predators who haven't found the right opportunity. Not threats held in temporary check. Just civilized beings who happen to possess impressive capabilities. Right, Vera said simply. Same as anyone else, really. Around the room, various creatures capable of conquering small planets exchanged glances that suggested they were having their own collective moment of species-wide identity reconsideration. This changes everything, Dr. Harwick whispered. Does it? Vera asked, returning to her sketches. Or does it just change how we think about things that were already there? She paused, stylus hovering over her notebook as a new thought occurred to her. Actually, I think there's something else you should consider. If apex predator species have been maintaining protective threat displays for so long that other species have forgotten their displays rather than genuine aggression, what does that suggest about the overall evolution of interspecies relations? That we've been building diplomatic protocols based on fundamental misunderstandings, Administrator Wellick said from the doorway, where they'd been quietly observing the proceedings. And that, Vera concluded cheerfully, is probably why nobody invited humans to join galactic civilization until recently. You were all too busy being afraid of each other to notice we'd figured out how to not be afraid of anyone. She looked around the room at the collection of beings who had spent their lives being either feared or fearful, now calmly coexisting in a space where neither was necessary. The good news is, she added, now that we're all here, we can probably figure out how to fix it. 3 apex predators purred agreement, while a room full of researchers frantically took notes, and Administrator Wellick began composing what would undoubtedly be the most interesting diplomatic communique in galactic history. Dr. Kell, meanwhile, revised his resignation letter to a request for additional classroom space. Apparently, revolutionary napping was about to become a very popular field of study.